we're up to the second passage, and here I wanted to talk about the concept that's recorded in verse number 2, and this is the concept of, it says, Ki tikneh eved ivri. When you purchase a Hebrew slave, 6 years he shall worship, and then the 7th year he will go free. So let me just give an introduction to this, and then we will read what Rashi has to say here. So there's two basic approaches. There's two basic aspects of slavery in the Bible, or in the rabbinic interpretation of the Bible, and it's really four. But there's two basic approaches. There's a Hebrew slave and a Canaanite slave. The Hebrew slave is, within the Hebrew slave, there's a male Hebrew slave and a female Hebrew slave. Within the Canaanite slave, there's a male Canaanite slave and a female Canaanite slave. So the male, let's just go first with the male Hebrew slave. The male Hebrew slave is somebody who, as Rashi is going to tell us, we could read the Rashi in a moment, is somebody who either sells himself into slavery because he cannot pay his own bills, or he's somebody who stole something and he can't pay it back. So the court says that he has to sell himself. The court sells him to pay off his debt. Now, the verse states here that Ki tikneh eved ivri, when you purchase this Hebrew slave, that his service is only for 6 years. 6 shanim yavod. His service is for 6 years. And then in the 7th year, he has to go free. No matter, even if he stole like a Bernard Madoff's amount, he would go free in the 7th year. That's the law of the Hebrew slave. And this Hebrew slave is really not something that's comparable to the concept of slavery as we know it in the modern world, which is really different, because the Hebrew slave, the first of all, he goes free. He's done a crime, and this was really a way to rehabilitate him. The Torah tells us that you're required to pay for his not only his upkeep, but also his wife, also his tuition, for his children. So it's said about the Hebrew slave, the Talmud says, Kona eved, Kona rabba. You acquire a slave, you've really acquired a master. I mean, and the Talmud tells us that if you have one pillow, the slave gets the pillow, the slave has to eat what you eat, the slave has to sleep on the same type of material that you sleep on. So really, the slave is not the proper translation for this person. In fact, what we're talking about here is a person who has committed a crime, and we are trying to help this person change his life. We have coming into our yeshiva this week a man by the name of David Ben Moshe, who was a man who was convicted of a crime, and he served time in Maryland State Prison. And he says when he came out of prison, not one place would hire him a job. He couldn't even get a job at McDonald's. And the only way he got a job was because there was one company that forgot to do a background check. You can imagine that when they finally did the background check, they probably would fire him. And then he completed all his coursework for a PhD. And then the university decided not to give him the PhD because he was a convict, even though they didn't have it on their website. The point is that if a person commits a crime in today's society and is convicted of that crime, their chances of re-entering into the society are extraordinarily difficult. And in fact, the whole notion of the prison system is completely foreign to the biblical worldview. The approach of the Torah, and I'm not saying we have to institute it today, was to either do physical punishment of, let's say, giving him lashes, and then he has to repay the amount he stole, and if he can't do that, he's raised in this manner. He basically moves in with somebody else for a period of time, and the concept would be that he would have a period of rehabilitation. So that is the Hebrew slave. The Hebrew slave, however, is not the only type of slave. There's also, as we see in our portion, we have time, we'll go into reading these verses as well. There's also the Hebrew female slave. The Hebrew female slave is something different than the Hebrew male slave. The Hebrew female slave is a case where the father sells his daughter into slavery. And in this case, she's sold into slavery, but he's only allowed to sell her while she is under the age of 12. And she too would also go free after 6 years, or when she has showed signs of becoming an adult. When she shows signs of becoming an adult, the person who he sold her to has to either marry her or release her. Now, why would the father sell his daughter into slavery? This was a system which obviously today sounds completely repulsive, abhorrent, disgusting. But in those days, in that society, it was obviously the father was unable to feed her. He was unable to keep her alive. And he was unable to make sure that she would have a way of being protected. They were living in a society where there was no social welfare network. And so nobody had a way to survive. And so therefore she would either be abused on the street, or she would starve to death. So the father would arrange basically for her marriage while she was a minor. And this basic idea of the Hebrew slave, of the Hebrew female slave, was something that I'm sure that must have been incredibly difficult for a father to do, but he did it as a way of providing safety and security for his daughter. And that was the approach. But even with that being said, the Torah places limitations on it. He was only allowed to sell his daughter one time. She would go free after 6 years. If she became an adult and they didn't marry her, she would go free. So that's the Hebrew female slave. Again, it's obviously something that I've never, ever, ever, it's literally a dead letter law. And then we come to the Canaanite slave. The Canaanite slave, this is something that is much more similar to the modern day notions of slavery. And that is, a person was allowed to acquire a Canaanite slave. Now, Canaanite slavery is obviously, it's hard for me to imagine a practice more abhorrent to our world than slavery today. It's nothing more disgusting, and yet the Torah allows it. So that's something that we as religious Jews who believe in the Torah have to try to understand. And the Canaanite slave is somebody that you're not supposed to release. The Torah says specifically you're not allowed to release him. And yet, even though the whole concept of a Canaanite slave is something that's very difficult for us to understand, the master is allowed to treat the Canaanite slave in a very harsh way. There are certain things that hint to the fact that the Torah recognizes the dignity of this person, that this person is a human being. So first of all, the Canaanite slave is somebody who goes free if you wound one of 24 limbs on his body. So if you beat him excessively, then the Canaanite slave would go free. And that's an indication that the Canaanite slave is a human being, and you have to be careful in how you treat this person. But to me, the most telling way is that in the Talmud, the Canaanite slaves are people who are the Talmud gives an example of a person who's a Canaanite slave who the rabbis freed in order to make a minyan. A Canaanite slave has some of the laws of being Jewish, but he wasn't able to count for a minyan. So they freed him in order to make a minyan. Now, a minyan is a rabbinic law, and not freeing a Canaanite slave is a biblical law. But the rabbis say that you're allowed to free the Canaanite slave in order to fulfill this rabbinic law. That shows us that the rabbis were very, very uncomfortable with the concept that they overrode a biblical law in order to fulfill this rabbinic law of having a minyan. It's not even a mitzvah; it's to have a minyan. But that's what they did, and that shows us the development of this law of slavery. Like today, there were again, it's a perfect example of a dead letter law, is that there's no concept. So why did the Torah have these concepts of slavery? This is something that is a very, very difficult question to answer. But we can say that the Torah does say that your Canaanite slave is also not allowed to work on Shabbat. You have to give your slave a day off. So probably way most people answer is that the Torah was given at a time where if the Torah would have said there's no such thing as slavery, then nobody would have accepted it. And the Torah had to try to create a society that would develop naturally and move towards this towards this place. But it's a really great question. How could the Torah have offered that? So let me just pause for a second, see if anybody has any questions. I'll be happy to address it.